Hi everyone, thank you for joining me today. I'm going to talk to you about our project on the Lost Wells of Galloway. So to start off with some introductions, my name's Claire and I work for Rathmel Archaeology. For the past 2 years we've been helping to deliver Can You Dig It, which is the community archaeology project for the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership. The Galloway Glens is a 5-year project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It involves organisations including Dumfries and Galloway Council. And Can You Dig It is match funded by Historic Environment Scotland and is set to continue until September of 2022. The Galloway Glens area is a grab of area that's in Dumfries and Galloway. It kind of runs from Carsfairn at the north down to include Dalry, Castle Douglas and down to Kirkcudbright at the south. So as with all community archaeology projects, 2020 brought unexpected challenges. And we all had a kind of last minute change of focus on what we were trying to deliver. Can You Dig It delivered a few different online events, but today I just want to focus specifically on our Lost Wells of Galloway project. The idea of looking at wells initially came from Dr Peter Hewitt of the Dumfries and Galloway Museum Service. He's done a lot of research into holy wells with a look to try and mapping them. So this stuck in my head because it's really not an area I've encountered much at all. And when we were looking at options for an online research project, it popped back into my head, Peter's Holy Wells. So Peter was very enthusiastic to support us in this, and we had discussions with our steering group, which eventually opened it up to a search for named wells and pools across our area. Myself, Peter and Helen Kerrin, Helen's the Galloway Glens project officer for Can You Dig It, had initial discussion about methods, and Helen had the great idea of launching the project with an online event. This combined a kind of short talk by Peter about wells and putting it into context, and then myself giving a kind of online tutorial on how to carry out the research. And then I opted for giving people their own map square to research, roughly about 5 kilometres in size. I then tried to come up with a simple research approach, identifying kind of the main resources for them to get started with. So first up was PassMap. This was allowed them to search for named well sites on modern maps, note their grid locations and also have a look for any possibly related Canmore entries in the nearby area. Next up was the National Library of Scotland for their digital map archives. This would allow people to work out a kind of mapping sequence for their sites and possibly also spot any more named wells or pools that might no longer appear on the modern maps. And then the Ordnance Survey name books, which are all freely available in Scotland's places. These were records that were compiled in the mid-1800s by the surveyors who went out and did the mapping, the first edition Ordnance Survey maps. And they contain a lot of stories on the background, given by local landowners and tenant farmers and so on. And lastly, it was the Galloway Place Names database, which is another one of the Galloway Glens projects. It's a large database which has 2,500 place names from the area, which has just been compiled over the last couple of years, with a lot of further information available on each of the names. Then lastly, it was just a case of doing a general internet search to see what else they could maybe come across on their site and also in any names that were associated with it. It was really a bit open to how much time people wanted and were able to spend on the project and how much detail they wanted to go into. I drafted up a kind of introductory note and a how-to guide for well research that we were then able to issue to everyone. Helen set up a Facebook group for the project as well so that people could share their research ideas, ask questions and also share their findings. If they wanted to sign up for the project, they just emailed Helen directly. Once we held the launch event at the end of January, and over the next couple of weeks 40 people signed up for a square, which was amazing. We ended up stretching the boundary just a little to try and fit everyone in, and I did my best to accommodate any special requests that people had, because you want it to be something that they're kind of got a vested interest in or they're particularly keen on that area, and it just helps if they're going to do some research on it. Out of the final 48 squares that we issued, some people came back for a second one, we received results back for 37 of them by the end of March. Now the results were submitted to Helen, who forwarded them on. They vary in detail and length, but it's actually been really lovely to see how the kind of reports reflect the individual styles of the researcher. The results will be compiled for submission to the Dumfries and Galloway Council Archaeology Service. Peter has a full copy for his records at the museum service and for his further research. Galloway Glens has also commissioned a handful of podcasts which will involve the researchers, and we're also looking at other ways we can display them. In the end, we've got around 60 named wells, 30 named pools, over 100 marked well sites, and also various named water features, including coastal locations, bays and waterfalls. So I'm expecting that to be keeping me busy for quite a while yet. The Facebook group will keep going, and I'll also be sharing the findings a lot over social media. So I'll be tagging it #Lost Wells of Galloway on both Twitter and Facebook if you'd like to see them, and that'll just keep going over the next few months. So now we can start to have a look into what the results have been so far. I'm still very much in the early stages of going through them all, so I want to try and touch on a few different examples of what we've had in, but it will mean that it'll be a little bit brief on each topic rather than going into a lot of depth, but I wanted to try and demonstrate the variety of themes and periods that the wells seem to cover. I also want to point out that it's at this point that I pull in all of my fellow researchers and contributors, and that these findings all represent a collaboration between everyone. I also like the quote on the screen, which was in the findings provided by Nick, dating back to the 1820s, because a large number of these wells and pools are still marked by their names on modern maps today, so that quote is very correct. Now, as good a starting point as any is looking at the folklore surrounding many of the wells. Now, these stem from simple tales, such as that at the £5 well. This is simply someone bet that £5 that he could drink all of the water in the well. He lost, but the well has been known by that name ever since. And there are some which are a bit more elaborate and a bit more gruesome, such as the Black Morrow well to the south of Kirkcudbright, which was discovered by Jenny. Now, the story goes here that the well takes its name from a figure called either Black Morrow or Murray, who caused much suffering in the area. Now, young William McClellan, the younger son of the former Laird of Bombay, wished to get his father's lands back. So to try and get favour, he went after Black Morrow and filled a well near Morrow's camp with spirits, which he then drank freely and fell asleep. McClellan, who had been watching from a safe place, sprung out and with one blow cut off his head. He stuck it on the point of his sword and took it to the King James II, who then returned the barony of Bombay to him. McClellan then took the image of a head and a sword for his crest. So there are many aspects that you can consider with regards to folklore. Sophia Kingshill mentions some of them in her introduction to the book The Lore of Scotland. There's a practical aspect which derives from the concerns of parents to keep their children away from dangerous places such as wells or deep pools. A horrible story is more likely to stick in their mind than just being told not to do something. And there are many of the wells and pools that appear in the results that have been named after someone who's drowned in them, such as the Englishman's Do that Keith found, where 2 Englishmen are said to have drowned. Some of the deeper pools have slightly menacing names, such as Loch na Vice and Deal's Well. But I can also believe that with adults as well as children, that we're equally capable of remembering stories which are much more grim and dramatic. And indeed, Scottish folklore does tend to be full of terror. Now, the stories around some of the wells reflect traditional beliefs in kind of supernatural beings. So Galloway Glens has both a fairies well and a brownies well, which I'll come back to in a minute. Just an example that's a bit further afield, there is a site known as the Cheese Well in the Borders. This is a natural spring that was said to have been the spot where travellers left cheese as an offering to the fairies to ensure safe passage through the area. So I like as well that at some point it stopped being cheese and has started being money that people have left. So it goes to show that while people are still, heeding the tradition, they don't believe in it enough to sacrifice their cheese sandwiches at the end of a long walk. So that's fair enough, I can see why. So a lot of our folklore reflects this idea of a hostile environment, one which was a struggle to survive in. Folklore can be a way of trying to make sense of your surroundings. It can personify the invisible forces of nature and give structure and guidance and a sense of some control over the circumstances, even if only in your imagination. Now, it's uncertain how many people actually continued to believe the stories, but they certainly carried on the traditions, just as many of us still touch wood or avoid walking under ladders today, or leave coins at the cheese well. These stories also offer a way of interpreting history, and this is reflected in the Galloway Glens, an area which certainly has had its fair amount of drama over the years. A number of events are reflected in their folklore and name. Now, I mentioned Brownie's Well, which sits near to Dorai earlier. Peter spoke about it also at the launch event. The story here centres on a farmer called Ramsay who helped to conceal Covenanters on his land. For those who don't know the area, Dalry was largely affected by the killing times in the 17th century when Covenanters were outlaws. He was summoned before the Council of Scotland, and while he was away, his farm was mysteriously taken care of. Overnight, the corn would be shorn, threshed and taken to the kiln before anyone was up the next day. The story started going round that it was Brownies doing the work, although in the end it turned out that it was the Covenanters who he had been helping out over the years. Now, a number of wells are also associated with historical figures such as William McClellan in the Blackmorrow Well, but also Cairn Edward Well, found by Keith, which relates to Edward Bruce, and also Willie's Well, found by Clare, where it's said that a Covenanter called William Auchinleck was killed and thrown into the well. Now, while it's difficult to know how much truth there is to these stories, they can give insights into people's views and understandings of the events. So, for example, the story of Brownie's Well shows a view that was sympathetic towards the Covenanters, likening them to brownies, which are seen as helpful creatures. So the fact that there's also the two wells with Covenanter associations shows how prominent a role they also played in the local history of the area. Another big aspect that can be seen across the wells which were discovered is that of seeing them as places of healing. So there seem to be something like over 600 healing wells across Scotland for curing anything from gout and hangovers through to blindness and mental health problems. Now, many people throughout Europe began to associate certain bodies of water with spiritual properties, and there's no doubt that many Britons revered the mystical quality of running water and came to associate it with wisdom, healing and fertility. Now, within the Galloway Glens research, there is the Rumbling Well and the Slot Well that sit near Dalbeattie, which were researched by Lynn. Now, the Rumbling Well is described as a good spring of water from the base of a natural bank, frequented by a multitude of sick people for all sorts of diseases going back to at least the 17th century. In contrast, the Slot Well was specifically for healing animals, mainly cattle. So you can see that they've got healing wells, but they've separated between the people and their livestock. Now, in these instances, there seems to be a bit of a ritual associated with getting the healing to work. So for the Rumbling Well, you would lie near to the well over the Saturday night before the first Sunday in May, and then you would drink from the well early in the morning. People would then leave money or clothes behind as a way of an offering or thanks. At the Slot Well, they would take the water away to wash their cattle with and then let them drink it. Here they would leave behind kind of the harnesses and shackles that we'd use to bound them. Now, I can only imagine if you were unwell at the time how it felt staying out all night at the Rumbling Well, but there does actually seem to be even more elaborate rituals recorded elsewhere. St Milrua's Well in Wester Ross was said to cure insanity. The afflicted individual had to be bound, then thrown from a boat and towed round the island 3 times clockwise. Upon landing, they would be taken to the well and given some of its water to drink. An offering would then be made by nailing a rag or ribbon to a tree or by driving a coin firmly into it edgewise. There were also punishments for removing items left as offerings. You would often take on the affliction that they represented. This type of consequence appears in the story of Gout Well of Larg near Minigaff. This was researched by William. A well for curing gout, it said that a piper stole away the offering left at the well. But when he was drinking the ale which he intended to pay with the money he had taken, the gout, as they say, seized on him, of which he could not be cured but at that well, having first restored to it the money which he had formerly taken away. Now, I like that there's a kind of sense of order to these stories, a balance and a reciprocity, giving back something for the cure and a fitting consequence for anyone who tries to steal from them. The elaborate rites perhaps give a kind of sense of legitimacy to the healing process, and possibly also is a good reason for why it might not work. Essentially, you've not done the rites properly. In terms of the physical sites themselves, they vary. At the Gout Well, which William did a great job of hunting out, it's possible to see that as a stone-lined structure. But at the Rumbling Well, we're very much looking at the site of a natural spring. There is some stonework which has been put in at the base of the bank, so it's possible to see a level of human intervention at the site, but it's not really enough that would mark it as a point which once held so much significance. In the book An Archaeology of Natural Places, Bradley writes that natural places have an archaeology because they acquired a significance in the minds of people in the past. That did not necessarily make any impact on their outward appearance, but one way of recognising the importance of these locations is through the evidence of human activity that is discovered there. So one possible way for doing this can be through the objects left as offerings, although the majority of our sites appear to have been cleared over the years. It's interesting though that the written records of the offerings left at the sites in the Galloway Glens do suggest that they reflected an agricultural economy, which isn't surprising in a rural area such as this. These including the harnesses left behind at the slot well. Looking elsewhere across Scotland, the objects left don't seem to have been high status ones. When you read about rags being tied to the trees, they seem to represent items which everyone would have access to, only gaining their significance through the act of being left as offerings. The results also include around a handful of wells are associated with saints, where the water is seen as having miraculous properties. Amongst our results there appear to be 2 wells dedicated to St Ninian, St Ringan's in Kelton and St Ninian's well which sits at Parton. The last one has been thoroughly researched by Sue. This well seems quite different to the Rumbling Well. It looks a bit more like a pond. It has a wall along one side though which has a small altar set into it with a Latin inscription. The well itself sits within its own enclosure, marked by a stone dyke and a gate entrance, and there are 2 steps leading down into the water, which you can kind of see in the bottom left there. This site doesn't appear with the name of St Ninian attached to it in maps until after the 1940s, however, before this just being shown as an unnamed spring. Sue was able to get in touch with the Hodsons, who currently live in the neighbouring property, and it's said that there's the site of a Roman Catholic chapel nearby, possibly built in the 16th century by the Glendonan family and then dismantled in the 18th century. The wall and the enclosure surrounding the well appear to have been built by the Murrays, who bought the Parton estate in the 19th century and went on to gentrify it. The altar set into the wall of the well apparently originally had a small figurine of Ninian, which has since been removed some time ago and is now in Parton House. Apparently they used to baptise people in the well, and the Hodsons have what is left of the cup used to pour water on children's heads. It's not really a surprise that there would be dedications to St Ninian in the area, being so close to Whithorn, where he became bishop at the end of the 4th century, and where his shrine went on to attract thousands of pilgrims over the centuries since. Now, it's said that early Christianity was bolstered by the power of the saints. Peter Yeoman writes that the early church was conscious of the need to align the attributes of the spirits and deities of pre-Christian times with the attributes of the saints, helping to make Christianity more palatable for the newly converted. One of our researchers, Simon, came across an article from the 1880s that discusses how traditional practices at well sites continued to occur after the growth of Christianity. This is perhaps the case with the Rumbling and Slot wells. It states that some of the wells were blessed by early missionaries to expel the demons associated with earlier forms of worship and to consecrate them for Christian service. The other significant factor of the sites of the saint wells is that they are often associated with the site of a church, or they can sit along a pilgrimage route. This could hint at the possibility of archaeological remains surviving unseen in the surrounding area. It's possible, for example, that St Ninian's or St Ringan's in the Galloway Glens may sit along a pilgrimage route which led to Whithorn. In the immediate aftermath of the Reformation in 1560, some holy wells were viewed as relics of paganism and the medieval cult of saints, and duly seemed irreligious by certain religious reformers. This would have seen many of them dismantled, although some became points of focus of resistance to the state church. Attitudes did eventually evolve, however, and many continued to visit holy wells. Lastly, there are a large number of wells amongst the results which are described as chalybeate. I'm sorry, I've seen that word pronounced a few different ways, so I apologise now if I'm saying it wrongly. This refers to waters that are impregnated with iron salts, and they seem to have been seen as having medicinal properties since the 17th century. A widespread view throughout Britain and Europe in the 18th century, some were even developed as commercial spas. This seems to have been the case at Lochinbrec Spa near Lauriston. This was the site of both a hotel and a well, which seems to have been around from the 18th century until it closed and then burned down in the early 1900s. The hotel made a feature of its spa well, creating a circular pavilion to enclose it with seats around and installing a pump for its water. Sue reports that it was a very popular attraction both for wealthy holidaymakers and for sufferers of TB and other ailments who sought out the well's medicinal properties. The writer and artist Malcolm MacLachlan Harper was a frequent visitor, and it's even said that Robert Burns also stayed there. So this element of wells and springs for healing continues, this time under a more scientific guise, and in the case of those which became spas, there is definitely more substantial structures built to encase them, leaving behind a more definite trace that can still be seen. Even at Lochinbrec, where it has been demolished, the base of the structure and the stands for its pump are still clearly visible. So to bring us up to today, a number of well sites have inevitably been lost over time, as well as actions after the Reformation. Many have likely been lost through land clearance and improvements relating to agriculture. Some have survived though, hidden away and overgrown, but still there and possible to go visit, as seen in these examples from the Galloway Glens. There are many elsewhere which have even seen a bit of a revival, or perhaps never forgotten, always with some offering left by passers-by as a minding to the old traditions and the touchwood effect. The sites of the wells hold a significance not just in the stories and traditions that they represent, but also in past understandings of the landscape. They highlight sites once seen as significant and sacred, and we can't be sure how far these views date back. They certainly seem to represent a wealth of information that is worth protecting before any further knowledge is lost. So just to say that the Lost Wells of Galloway project certainly isn't the first or only project that's looking at recording these sites. I just wanted to put up a link of another couple of projects I've come across, although I imagine there are many more. And I know that there are various blogs and websites and social media accounts also dedicated to their record. And to end, I just wanted to give a final thank you to Helen and Peter. I know Helen's thoroughly enjoyed talking to all the volunteers that have been emailing in, and Peter, I hope this helps very much with his research into the Holy Wells. A massive thank you to all the volunteers and our contributors and our researchers. Even if you didn't have the chance to do as much research as you'd hoped, life gets in the way sometimes. I very much appreciate how much you have embraced this project. A final thank you to the funders and to the Society for letting me speak today, and as I play you out to the sounds of the rumbling well, thank you to yourselves for spending the last 20 minutes listening to me talk about wells.